So this is me mansplaining Terry Pratchett, mansplaining sexism to you. It's mansplainception, and that's a good thing, right? Cheers. Welcome back to me talking about books, and not only books, but one book in particular, and it's a Discworld book. It is Monstrous Regiment, which is book number 31, I think? Maybe 32? I'm getting confused. It's high numbers. I'm not supposed to think about high numbers. Anyway, it is a wonderful book, yet again, and it is a standalone, and it's a standalone for grown-ups. So there we have it, and we'll do the usual thing. I'll give a quick summary when I tell you why you really should go and read this book, and then I'll have a bit of a beer, and you'll come back, and then we'll talk about themes and stuff that may or may not include a lot of spoilers. So, everyone ready? Then let's do that right after I talk about me currently asking for some financial help, because I'm in a bit of a tight spot, and if you could either share or maybe even give me some money, there's a GoFundMe link down there. I would really appreciate it, but as I said, if you don't have any money to spare or whatever, maybe spread the word. That would be nice. And now, let's actually talk about war. What is it good for, right? Alright, Monstrous Regiment is a book about war. It follows a girl named Polly that disguises herself as a man to join the army to fight a war and find her brother. And during that whole story, she encounters a lot of injustice and other things and has adventures, and then there's no real happy end. And that's a good thing. So, there's why I think you should go and read it, because it's Terry Pratchett tackling sexism, war, possibly propaganda, religion, a lot of other topics that have been floating around Terry Pratchett's work for a long time, and in this one, they come together fairly, well, almost tightly knit, and there's a level of seriousness there that not many Discworld novels have, and I think it works beautifully in this one. As I said, it's a standalone, so you can just go and read it without any strings attached. There's not even that many connections to other Discworld novels with characters and stuff, so you don't even have to, know other stuff to get the full Discworld feeling with this one. It's a good starting point if you want to see just later Discworld. Anyway, that's all I have to say. You should go and read it. It's one of the best, I think. And once you've read it, we'll talk about spoilers, right? I'll just have a bit of a beer. You're back? Great. I hope you enjoyed the book. If so, let me know down in the comments, and, like and subscribe. And, yeah, let's talk about topics, themes, and other things that make this book so good. I'll start with a quick one. I think it works so well as a story because it has one main plot line, and we'll usually just follow that plot line. We have one main focus character, that is Polly, compared to a lot of other Discworld novels that have a lot of different characters floating around, doing all kinds of stuff, because Terry Pratchett usually just writes about all the things that come into his head, connected to one story that float around it. This one is very tight, and it's very easy to follow just Polly and her squad, basically, with the few perspectives of, well, mostly just Vimes sitting at his office desk. That makes it very easy to follow, and that makes the message of the story feel almost too straightforward for a Terry Pratchett novel. In that regard, it's a bit comparable with Nightwatch that we talked about recently, that also mostly focuses just Vimes in that case. So in that regard, it works very well. It's once again following that later Discworld stage when we have more direct connections to the real world. This time round, it is obviously not set in Ankh-Morpork, but there is a connection to Nightwatch that I just mentioned. Remember back in the day when we talked about Nightwatch, and it starts out with Vimes and Captain Carrot walking to the Patrician's palace to talk about Watch Committee, and Carrot is reading out the news, and he talks about a war between Borogravia and Slovenia, and Vimes back then says, well, I'm already on the side of Borogravia, because the Times at the time said that they should be on the side of Slovenia. So now we actually hear about that war in full. And that's not the first part that we'll talk about. We'll talk about it, though, in a minute. Let's start with the, well, elephant in the room, so to speak. Let's talk about the sexism and the feminism and all of that, because it's obviously the main focus of this book. Now, readers of more Discworld novels already know that feminism or sexism has been a topic that Terry Pratchett has been dealing with before, certainly all the way back to, well, equal rights in a way, and then in the Witches books, and it shows up in the Watch books whenever, well, in book 15, which is Men-at-Arms, when Angua joins the squad, and it becomes more of a thing in Feet of Clay and so forth. So it is something that has been on Pratchett's mind for a while, and it took him a while to tackle it. And he has always tackled it in all kinds of different ways, and this time around he chose a very direct route. And I remember the first time reading the book, I was not happy with that, because almost a bit too on the nose for me. But then I started reading the news and I started thinking about stuff and looking at the world right now. Yeah, maybe you just have to use the sledgehammer, because not much has changed. I just recently reread Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, and yeah, nothing has changed really. So let's have a quick look at what Pratchett does in this one and why I think it works so well. First of all, he does very much look at different ways patriarchy or sexism actually harm and hurt women. And he does have, well, more or less examples for all of these during this book, and focusing on the victims, on the still marginalized people, is really helping the message here, because he does show just how the system does still do a lot of harm, or how the system does a lot of harm. And once you start reflecting about it, yeah, most of those things we still have around. So let's have a quick look at all of these. Let's start with Polly. Polly does go out more or less, because she can't inherit she can't inherit the Duchess, in this case the inn, because only men can inherit those kind of things. Now, obviously, property rights have changed in the last 70, 80, 90 years, depending on where you live. But it's still sort of a problem that there are just things that women can't have a much harder time to getting away with or getting. And the other part is, of course, that Polly used to be the one that looks after her brother, that does all the heavy work, that does all the emotional labor in the house ever since her mother died, taking care of the brother, making sure everything runs smooth. And that is, once again, one of those things that we still have to deal with, which is women have to do all the labor that no one pays attention to, that even doesn't get paid in the household and so forth. So we have that aspect. We have other aspects. We have, of course, one Private Manacle, also known Shufti, who is looking for her boyfriend, or at least the man that got her pregnant. Now, unwanted pregnancies are quite a thing, and the fact that men can still get away with it, yeah, that's also still a thing. And we'll not even go down the abortion discussion in this one, because it doesn't really come up. But yeah, the fact that women are left alone with pregnancies is very much a thing that you find in books on feminism, like, for example, Beauvoir, but you do also find it in reality. So having that part in there makes a lot of sense. Who else do we have? Well, we do have two girls in this case who ran away from the, poor girls' working school, which is half poorhouse, half, prison, half, all of boarding school and so forth. And yeah, we don't even have to go there. There is, there's evidence that at least one of the girls got sexually abused by people that, exploited during their stay there. We know about all of the things that have happened at Christian schools, whether it's in Ireland, whether it's over in, Canada with native people and so forth. We know about these things, so having that in there, and how oftentimes girls are even, more often victims of sexual abuse and other abuse. Yeah, it's in there. It's very dark. So we have three girls from there. We'll talk about the last one later on, so don't worry. Then we have the fact that depending on what kind of career choice you make as a woman, you still have it pretty hard. And it used to be even worse. And in this case, that's obviously Igorina, who is an Igor and a surgeon, and, it's still kind of tough to become to be taken seriously in some jobs, some career fields, if you're a woman. And yes, we might be nowadays at a point where on paper there is no such discrimination, but reality is still very much different. So having these different aspects in there, I think works really well, because it does show these forms of discrimination that are still on the table out there. The fact that the solution is usually, yes, you girls just need to get married and have a man care for you. I don't know. Go watch conservative news somewhere, and you'll find out that idea is still very, very strong. So while for people on the more progressive side of things, it may sound like preaching to the choir, well, that choir is still not as large as it should be, is it? So I can live with it, and as I said, focusing exclusively on these people, on the women, makes it very powerful, because we don't hear of any of the men that perpetrate these crimes. They don't get screen time at all, or page time in this case. And I think that's a very powerful statement, to just focus on the women in this regard. I do very much appreciate that. And during their walk and their trip all the way to the fortress, during their travels, we obviously see more of these elements. We see, well, one man one man sexually assaulting Polly, the main character. She does defend herself and knock him out, and all of that's fair and square, but the fact that men still think that they can just go and force themselves on women, well, that's still out there, is it? And so having that portrayed in there is, well, not the nicest thing to see, and all of that, but I think it is important to bring these things into fantasy, and especially into a more lighthearted fantasy world like Discworld, where it's so easy to go like, isn't it funny? It's comedy, right? And it's like, yeah, it's comedy, but it's still like our world. Our world is pretty dark, so maybe we should have these things in there. And comedy is not just, fun and games. It's fun and games, but it's also dark. And having that, and in particular the scene where the deserters murdered the charcoal burners, Pratchett has gotten really good at describing really dark things in a humane, dignified way. I think that's the way I would put that. It's very, very touching in a way that he does do so without actually giving you any details of any sort. He just manages to do these things in a very powerful way, the same way he did in Night Watch when he talks about the Room of Tortures. And he's gotten really good at it at this point, and I just want to point this out because, once again, Discworld has a reputation of being, comedy. And there is still humor in here, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of humor in this one, but there's also a lot of darkness in here. Yeah, let's move forward. We can see beyond the sexism, but also the idea of gender roles that is very much explained here, right? Because all these women dress up as men, and suddenly they can do whatever they want. Not that they couldn't have done it so before, but it's very much about like the gender role is what makes these things possible. And well, once again, this is not exactly the most modern take on the subject. So little has changed that we still have to deal with the fact that appearance and gender performance does have such a huge impact. And we see this obviously with the way they behave once they dress up as women. They get taken, well, not taken seriously anymore, and so forth. On the other hand, it does also show how ridiculous some of the sort of male or masculine performance can be, which is, all about, picking nose, farting, all these things. Well, yeah, that's exactly what boys in their teens do, right? It's not exactly new, or at least they can get away with it, sort of. We have that, and then it all kind of culminates in, obviously, the final discussion both of Jackram, we'll talk about Jackram in a minute, and well, the glass ceiling and all of that. See, once it is revealed that there are a lot of officers in the army that are all women that, well, decided to dress up as men, or present male to actually get into the army, having the General Frock admit that that she only promoted people that were well, better than men, only promoted women when they were better than men. Yeah, that's very much the the level of survivor bias that we find in economy and politics up to this day, where people, the few women that made it all the way to the top, give other women a harder time than they might. Except, of course, the other person in this regard, which is Sergeant Jackram, who helped other women that they discovered during their time in the army. And I'm not the first person pointing this out, but the way Pratchett actually does change pronouns in the conversation between Polly and Jackram is really interesting, because we're still talking a book from 2004 here, right? This is not, or 2003 maybe even, this is not 2020's pronoun discourse, but he manages it fairly well, right? We get called, Jackram gets called he uses he/him pronouns for Jackram all the way until Jackram says that yes, they were born, or in this case she was born as a woman, and then he uses she/her pronouns until Jackram decides to go on male presenting, because that's basically who they are at this point, and then he switches back to he/him pronouns, and once again, that's fairly progressive for 2002. I mean 2004, sort of. And I just wanted to point out that that Pratchett manages to actually use these things without making a big fuss about it. So while maybe in 2023 it doesn't come across as revolutionary, it certainly was 20 years ago, or at least for the mainstream audience that Terry Pratchett at the time certainly catered to. So that's something that I found interesting or impressive in a lot of ways, how this worked out. But there's obviously more to this, because of course there is Nuggin and the religion. Now, what's interesting about this? See, Nuggin shows up in The Last Hero. He's just a quick person who Cohen the Barbarian meets up on Cori Celesti in Dun Manifesting, and he's already big on being a dickhead there. And now he's apparently dead. And as I said, Pratchett has dealt with religion before, obviously in Small Gods. It's very much about the relationship between gods and their believers, and how an institution will go on even though no one will actually believe in the god anymore. And while manages in conversation with Brutha to actually, well, make a comeback and become a more humane god, Nuggin obviously failed. And the way Pratchett talks about how Nuggin's abominations are just people's fears thrown back at them. That's very much a direct attack on, well, more the evangelical side of Christianity, the way more conservative side of religion that does just forbid. And while I do have more nuanced takes on religion in general, but I think in the context that we're talking about here, which is once again, a very, very, terrible regime in a lot of ways, I think it works. It makes a lot of sense to look at this way that religion can be used by conservative people that to keep the little power they still have on humanity. And in that regard, it is obviously interesting to see that whenever we talk about people who reinforce or keep reinforcing the rules of the church there and of behavior that keep women down, these are all pathetic people. There's, on the one hand, it's obviously the political arm, and we'll go there for a second in a minute, but it's also made clear several times, it's the old women, it's people that have suffered through that system that keep reinforcing the system. They don't want any change. They don't want the people after them to have it better or freer. It's unfortunately part of all kinds of restrictive systems that we end up trying to perpetuate the oppression that we suffer through because of, well, jealousy up to a point, envy, whatever you want to call it. And Pratchett, well, does show so very, very clearly when he talks about that. But he also makes it very clear that we don't have to listen to these kind of people. We don't have to listen to old people when they tell us that no one complained back in their day and so forth. We don't have to listen. We can make a better world, which is obviously the goal of Discworld all along. Be better people, make a better world. Now let's look at the politics, shall we? See, I talked about how Discworld becomes more explicitly like our world, and obviously the Dark Empire, Uberwald, which is sort of where we are here as well, with Borogravia and Slovenia and so forth, is very much modeled on whatever you might call post-Soviet or post-Soviet countries at this point. And I think it is telling the way Pratchett approaches this, which is that it is about Ankh-Morpork's meddling in the place. And we have, obviously, we have the remainders of a secret service there, or the secret police, in this case, the politicals, with Corporal Strappy trying to keep, in power, which is something we certainly haven't seen with post-1989, 1990 Russia or anywhere there, right? We also have not seen how some people try to take over a modern, or a system they perceive as more modern, in this case that being very much capitalism, and trying to out-capitalize the West. That's certainly something that we haven't seen in former... I'm trying to be ironic here. Never mind. When you go and talk to people in the East at this point, there is a lot of things where you can see that the damage that both the Soviet oppression, but also the so-called reforms pressed upon the East after 1990 by the West, and also the attempts to outcompete mostly the U.S., but the general Western capitalist hegemony, the damage that does. And we see that here as well, with Prince Heinrich of Slovenia really wanting to be like Ankh-Morpork as quickly as possible, and obviously, taking the worst aspects of that and using those and trying to use those to take over or get away with occupying another country, which is sort of what almost happens when the West and Ankh-Morpork does support his attack on on Borogravia, all the way until they fight back and so forth. And the idea that they want to be left alone and figure these things out on their own, I think that's a very interesting point, a very good point, that while helping with, food supplies and so forth is a good idea, but trying to force your own system on another country. We've seen how these missions have gone in the past. And once again, this is written in 2003, 2004, which is very much when certain parts of the West were big on bringing democracy to other parts of the world, with terrible results. So we can probably see some criticism of that sort in Monstrous Regiment as well. Once again, it's fairly on the nose, but as I said before, sometimes you just need a sledgehammer, because just tapping the shoulder doesn't really work. Now let's look at some of the last points that I wanted to make. There's, of course, the whole Joan of Arc sort of storyline of a young girl hearing voices, having to go there and take over the army. We've seen that before. There's parallels between the Duchess and Queen Victoria. Obviously, when young Prince Albert died, Queen Victoria went into mourning for a long time. We kind of forget that until she actually came back and did public appearances. So the whole idea of someone being in mourning forever kind of connects to that, and Pratchett does, once again, so in a good way, I guess. I think he does show war, and I think there's an interesting aspect here. I've said this before. Terry Pratchett is very aware of the responsibility of artists when it comes to writing, telling stories, creating songs, and so forth, to actually influence people's minds. In this case, it's folk songs. It certainly is folk tales, propaganda that leads a lot of people to join the army, because soldiers' life has been, romanticized in a lot of ways. And we can see Pratchett sort of playing with that. On the one hand, he does show elements that you might call also romanticizing of a soldier's life, but he also shows the darkness that actually lies underneath it. That is, people have to die, because sometimes that's just what war is, and civilians will suffer from it, and there will be refugees, because soldiers, don't actually bring a lot to the table when it comes to actually making the country a better place. So there's that also added to the story. And once again, he manages to still keep a relatively light tone throughout this, while still very much having a very dark topic to deal with. And well, he does also manage so by quoting or referencing a lot of other war movies, mostly Vietnam and connected movies. We definitely have the whole Full Metal Jacket references there, with Private Maledict writing "Born to Die" on their helmet, or in this case, hat, which is a reference to Full Metal Jacket. We have the whole, like, I want to go to different countries to meet exotic people, although it's obviously Jade, the troll, saying erotic people first, which is a great joke, don't get me wrong. So we have these elements of how in there as well. And they manage to, while being references to war movies, they also add to these questions like, how do we portray war in our media, depending on what we want to achieve with that, and how do we manage to show that war is bad and criticize war without also still, well, romanticizing it in some forms or in a way. So I think it's a very complicated topic, a very complicated question, and despite being fairly direct in a lot of ways, it manages to be far more nuanced than it appears on the first read, which is, well, what you want from a Discworld novel that you can go and read again and again and again, which is certainly what I have done with this one. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. And once again, if you enjoyed it, I don't know, let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I'd appreciate that. And maybe like and subscribe and share and do all those YouTube things that I'm supposed to ask you. And once again, if you could help me out a bit with money or sharing the Fund Me thing, that would also mean the world to me. Yeah, and that's all I have to say on Monstrous Regiment for now. And now I'm waiting for you to start the discussion, and I'll be back talking about the next book very soon. And until then, thanks and cheers.